friends, welcome back, or welcome if you're new here. My name is Stacy and I am the Chapter Conundrum. And in today's video, we're going to wrap up my December reads. So we're going to talk about all the things that I read in the month of December and how I felt about them. So December, in terms of like how much I read, was a pretty average reading month for me. And in terms of quality of what I read, it was a very mixed bag for me. I had some stuff in the 4-star range, and I also had like a DNF, which is pretty rare for me. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in and talk about it. I will also mention, for anyone wondering, from my December TBR video, I mentioned that I had 3 prompts left in my 2024 reading challenge in order to finish it, and I will happily say I did manage to finish those 3 prompts, though I did switch out one of the books because I had a library hold come in that fit one of the prompts, and it was like a quicker, shorter thing. Anyway, the point is, I finished it and I did it, so yay. We're going to talk about these in the order that I read them, and we did not start the month off strong. We started off with The Writing Retreat, which I DNF'd at the 55% mark. And I had several complaints with this one, but the straw that kind of broke the camel's back, so to speak, is that there was a scene in here where there's like footprints in the snow of somebody who supposedly left or like sleptwalked in the middle of the night. And then they go look outside in the morning and they've said like, oh, it snowed like so much. And they specifically mention that the snow kind of like blew in on the porch stoop, and they're somehow still seeing this person's footprints. And I was just like, I don't think this author knows how snow works. I was already kind of struggling with several elements of this book. I thought that the writing was kind of like trying to be very gritty or edgy. I thought the characters were just like very catty and sort of angsty and not really my vibe. I also wasn't really loving the spooky elements in here or the inclusion of dreams. So dreams are something I almost never enjoy in books, but in this one they just seemed like they really didn't have a purpose for being there, and the content of them made it kind of lean into like the author just trying to be more like edgy or gritty or something. I don't know. It wasn't for me. The spooky elements were like wishy-washy, and like I couldn't put my finger on what was actually happening, which is not something I like in spooky elements. I just had a whole slew of complaints with this one. Oh, and the other complaint I had was that the foreshadowing in here felt very heavy-handed. And it turns out I was completely spot on with that, because Jake had finished the book already, and I looked in like the buddy read chat under his spoiler tags after I had decided to DNF, and I was like, oh yeah, I saw that coming a mile away based on the foreshadowing. Like, it was obvious to me. I'm glad I didn't finish it. Let's put it that way. So yeah, not giving it a rating, just saying I DNF'd it at 55%. Next up, I had a library hold of the audio of Two Twisted Crowns come in, and this is the second book in the Shepherd King duology. And I read book 1 a couple months ago, and I had things about it I really liked and things about it I really didn't like. And then book 2 unfortunately took the series downhill for me, and I ended up rating this a 2-star. So to kind of sum up my brief thoughts about book 1, I really loved the magic system that was introduced and the fantasy plotline we sort of had going on, but I didn't really care about the characters or the romance. But I was at least interested enough to read the second book to see the story through and see what comes of this fantasy plot, and you know, if we uncovered anything more about the magic system. So before I go into my complaints about this book, because you know they're going to be here given that I gave it a 2-star, I do have something positive to say. And that is that the magic system did have a new kind of like element to it that was discovered in this book, or made known to the reader in this book. And I definitely enjoyed that. I think if we had had a lot more of that I would have enjoyed this a lot more. But unfortunately here, there was sort of like one instance where it was expanded, and then that element of it was kind of like harped on and used over and over and over and over in the book, to the point where it felt like it was repetitive plot-wise, and it didn't work for me. I usually don't like in books when they kind of have like one thing that's used over and over, and it kind of makes the plot a little bit more predictable, and it definitely did that for me here. So unfortunately, it was kind of like a pro-con. But let's get into the complaints I had with this one. So unfortunately, I felt like the main plot line of book 1 that I was interested in was very much like sidelined in here. We got a lot of focus on a different plot line with other characters that we kind of knew, but I just wasn't as invested in what was happening with them as I was in the original plotline. And then the tidbits we did get of the original plotline, this is hard to kind of dance around without spoiling anything, but sort of like there's a new element to that sort of changed the dynamic of them, and they became a lot more intangible, and it was hard to like put your finger on what was happening. And then also just like the solutions or the steps towards the solution just didn't hit the same way that the setup did for it in book 1. I also will say I'm still not invested in any of the romantic elements of this series at all. I feel like they're all so insta-lovey and they're just not developed enough for me to grow attached. And so unfortunately, that complaint carried through into this book for me. And then I also wrote down in my notes here that I wasn't really loving the past timeline stuff. I can't remember specifically why I wasn't really that interested in the past timeline stuff, but I wrote that it wasn't done in a way that I found interesting. And I think maybe just that we didn't really get enough plot surrounding things that happened back then. Like, I thought this would have been a lot stronger had we also seen like the motivations and the reasoning and the plot kind of that tied into that past timeline stuff more. But anyway, I have at least finished another series on my list, and I no longer have to wonder about how that would go and how the fantasy plotline and magic system are utilized in the series because I've finished. So I can at least say it felt good to finish out another series before the end of the year. My next book I had a much better time with, thankfully, and it was my favorite read of the month, and I gave it a 4.5-star rating, and that was Heartless Hunter, or The Crimson Moth if you have the UK edition, by Kristen Ciccarelli. And this was something I read in a gift box vlog experience, so I'll link that up here. If you haven't seen the vlog yet, it was a really fun thing to do. Essentially, my sister and I exchanged book boxes, and we had kind of curated them for each other. But we picked out a book, read the book, picked out gifts that related to things mentioned in the book, wrapped them, put like the appropriate page number on where to open the corresponding thing, and then exchanged boxes, and we each got to have this really fun experience. So first and foremost, I have to say, I loved the experience of doing that. That was the first time I had seen or done anything like that, and it was really interesting. I feel like it's an excellent strategy for me moving forward to get out of a reading slump potentially. And I know there is a service that does this, which is what inspired my sister to do this, but I think like that service only does a few gifts. I'll put the link to that in the description if I can figure it out. But anyway, if you haven't watched the vlog, you're missing out because it was a fun time. So go check that out and see what gifts I got with this. But I did have a really great time with this, and I gave it a 4.5-star rating. I did think that the author did an excellent job of just introducing you to the characters and introducing tension to the story very early on. The stakes felt like they were very high right from the go. This was really engaging and definitely had me invested, even regardless of the book box experience. I thought that this had a really great balance between an exciting plot and a tension-filled romance. I did think that the pacing of kind of how it developed was a little bit more towards the side of the plot, which was interesting. But if you can suspend your disbelief on kind of like the pace at which it develops because of the plot, it's definitely awesome. The only other thing I really have to say about this is I kind of question why the author decided to write this as YA. She definitely has a lot of content that's sort of like mentioned in here. There is one spicy scene that's, you know, not very well described because it is YA. But the fact that she's including like dark things from the characters' backstories and a spicy scene is like, why didn't you just kind of go for this as adult and then you could really like delve into those things? And I think that's what could have made it a 5-star read for me, because we really could have gotten into like the characters' reactions and feelings and emotions surrounding some of the really hard stuff that they went through and are going through, and it would have made the book more memorable for me. But all in all, I definitely had a great time reading this, would highly recommend, and I've already made Jake pre-order me the sequel, Rebel Witch, for my like Valentine's Day book, because we always exchange a book on Valentine's. So I'm really looking forward to finishing out this series and seeing where the plot goes. Next up, I picked up and read Amari and the Night Brothers by B.B. Alston. And this was my pet pick that Ozzy chose for me during my TBR last month. And I had a really good time with this and gave it a 4-star rating. I did think that the character work and the social commentary in here was excellent, but the plot in here and like the world building had a lot of elements of things I had seen done before, or things that felt pulled from other series that are pretty popular or beloved. And being that I am more of a plot reader than a character reader, my enjoyment suffered a little bit for that. But even though I'm not the typical audience for this, I still had a good time with it and would recommend it, especially for the unique character voice in Amari. I also thought that this was a really fun balance between more like lighthearted and serious stuff, but age appropriate, of course. And I think it's one of those middle grade series that, while it's marketed for younger audiences and can definitely be read by them, reading it as an adult or like as somebody older will also give you like another layer to the story and what's happening. So this is definitely one that's good for all ages. So next up, I finished out another series and picked up Age of Empyre, the final book in Legends of the First Empire by Michael J. Sullivan. This is book 6. And I gave this a 3.75-star rating. So this is kind of middle of the road in the series for me. I did find it very satisfying that we got a lot of answers to a lot of the lore things that were kind of introduced or that I was wondering about. And I also thought that there were definitely some good character moments in here. And it was very funny to me that the parts of this that I was the most invested in were like the stuff surrounding the fray, which at the beginning of the series was the stuff that I was the least invested in. So definitely I think like having more context about sort of like that whole aspect of the plot over time led to my enjoyment of it growing so much more. And I definitely appreciate those aspects of the series more now, having finished this. It'd be interesting to see if I ever reread this someday, if I end up like bumping my rating for the earlier books up now that I'm like more invested in the fray stuff because I know kind of like where it's going. I think there are kind of two main reasons that my enjoyment of this one wasn't as high as it was for some of the other books in the series. The first one of those is that we kind of got a lot of content surrounding sort of like the gods in this world, or the equivalent, I guess. And I was just less invested in them than I was in the characters that I went through the whole series with. And I felt like it gave me kind of like more answers in terms of the gods than I really cared for, in a way. I wish that we kind of had more moments with the characters that we experienced the rest of the series with instead of so much of that. But I definitely think that a lot of people who read the series will be thankful that that stuff is here and enjoy it. It just didn't work as well for me personally. The other thing that I found interesting about this entry in particular is that, given that it's Michael J. Sullivan's kind of like newer end of what I've read from him, I kind of expected him to go more in the direction of like being bittersweet, because the ending of the first arc of this series is more bittersweet, but this one definitely tries to veer more towards feel good, which is kind of like what I experienced from some of his very early work. And while a lot of readers are gonna love that about this, it definitely doesn't work as well for me as his more like serious bittersweet stuff. I think I just kind of suffered from having higher expectations because I loved books 2 and 3 in this series so much, and they definitely had more of like the tone that I gravitate towards a bit more. Overall, I definitely recommend this series, and I found so many things in here to enjoy. I'm really glad that I finished it out and got some answers that I was wondering about. And I'm definitely eager to continue on in this world and eventually read the Rhyra Chronicles and probably reread Revelations too, because it's been a hot minute and I miss Royce and Hadrian. I'm going to talk about the next 2 books I read together because they're both volumes in the same graphic novel series. And that's I Hate Fairyland Volume 6 and 7. So Last Skirt Standing and In the Meantime. And it was fun that I was finally able to get my hands on these because I had been reading the series on Everend, but they haven't added the new installments yet. But I did finally go and get a local library card in our local city now that I have proper ID here. And the library here uses Hoopla. And Hoopla had the newest installments in a couple of the graphic novel series I had been reading and waiting on. So it was fun to binge through a couple of those one evening. So Volume 6, I gave a 4-star rating, and Volume 7, I gave a 3-star rating. I don't have a ton to say about either of these, but Volume 6 I thought was one of the better volumes in the series overall. I thought it was really fun to kind of see some Easter eggs that harkened back to or revisited things that happened earlier in the series, and I just had a lot of fun with the plot in this one as well. And then in Volume 7, I kind of felt like it wasn't really a cohesive plot, sort of similar to book 2 in the series. it kind of felt a little bit all over the place. There were definitely still some very enjoyable moments, and I definitely cracked a smile and laughed. But ultimately, this installment felt a little bit more towards filler, which I didn't love. I'm definitely eager for volume 8 to come out eventually, and will likely check it out when it drops, or as soon as my library or Hoopla or somebody has it. So another graphic novel series I had been waiting on getting my hands on, the new installment that ended up being on Hoopla, was Sarah Scribbles, and Hoopla had her newest one, Adulthood is a Gift. And this is like sort of a nonfiction memoir but humorous type graphic novel, with the author drawing panels about like real life experiences that are very relatable and usually very funny. And this volume definitely didn't disappoint. There were several funny and relatable moments in here where I laughed. I will say that some of the panels felt a little bit repetitive topic-wise. I felt like she could have broadened the scope of some of the topics she covered in here, and it could have been stronger. But overall, it was still really enjoyable. And the new kind of thing in this installment, I don't remember this from previous installments, is that she had chunks of text introducing some of the panels later on in the book. From what I can remember of the first 4 graphic novels in the series, they were like all graphic novel. So it was interesting to get the author's feedback on a few of her early panels and just talk about her experience and what led to her coming up with those ideas, and to also hear her talk about how she's grown and learned from her experiences too. This is definitely a series I would recommend if you are into nonfiction humorous stuff. It reminds me a lot of Hyperbole and a Half by Ali Broche, which is an all-time favorite of mine. And I gave this installment in the series a 4.25 star rating. I can't remember what I've rated all the other ones in the series, but there were definitely some 5s in there for me. And overall, this is just a fun time and I recommend it. Next up, I picked up and finally read Babel by R.F. Kuang. And this is something I had really been looking forward to for quite a long time because I read and loved the Poppy War trilogy. This is definitely very different from Poppy War, and I had been warned about that before I went in. But I definitely still expected like certain elements of her writing to kind of carry forward into this. And some of those things did and others didn't. So we'll definitely talk about that. But this is a historical fantasy that follows Robin Swift, and he's a young boy who was orphaned in Canton. And he's brought to Britain to be trained in Greek and Latin so that he can attend Oxford and be part of the Translators Guild. The translators are very important in this alternate history because the magic system here involves like putting translated concepts onto silver bars in order to make things work. And so you definitely have to be fluent in multiple languages in order to be able to use the magic system that's present here. So true to R.F. Kuang's writing, the heart of this book is really the themes. She definitely did an excellent job crafting a story around a theme that she wanted to explore. And she definitely had to think a lot of things out when writing this. I think where I kind of struggled here a bit was that in Poppy War, she definitely has a lot more focus on plot and character work, whereas in here, it's almost entirely theme focused, or at least there is character work, but it feels very different. Like Rin, the protagonist of Poppy War trilogy, is very emotional and she's not afraid to tell you how she's feeling in any given moment or how she's reacting to something. And our protagonist in here, Robin, is very nonchalant and doesn't really let you in on how he's feeling. He does tell you how he's thinking about certain things in the book, but for me, it kind of had an emotional distance because of that. And unfortunately, it didn't work as well for me. Sorry if anything's changed. My phone rudely interrupted me telling me I was out of storage space, which I just had to clear my recently deleted stuff in order to make that work. But anyway, I think I was talking about how I didn't connect to Robin in the same way that I connected to Rin because he felt very kind of like nonchalant and didn't really let you in on his emotional process. And while he told you his thoughts, it just didn't have the same depth to it for me that Rin did. And then the plot in this one is just very slow moving and very unlike Poppy War in terms of like, this one you just feel very pulled along for the ride. It's very meandering. You don't really get to have theories or guesses on anything. You're just kind of told things, and it's the type of thing you watch unfold in front of you. Whereas in Poppy War, you get to have theories and guesses for things along the way, and it just felt like a very different experience. I did really like the direction that this ended up going in, but it just kind of took forever to get there for me. I think it was like, I don't know, the 75%, 80% point where things finally picked up for me. But I will say, on the journey to get to that point, the social commentary in here is excellent and well thought out. There were definitely a lot of things that R.F. Kuang considered in writing this story. I just wish that some of it hadn't been quite so heavy-handed. I don't feel like I needed the footnotes to explain some of the things that were explained in here. Like, the story kind of tells you something and then the footnotes sort of hammer it home again. I feel like it would have been more powerful if it was kind of like left up to the reader to figure those things out for themselves. But definitely a lot of consideration and heart went into writing this, and I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it. And I really hope that in the future she decides to get back into writing more dark fantasy type stuff, because that's definitely where my enjoyment lies with her the most. I ended up feeling kind of meh about the majority of this and gave it a 3-star rating. And then the last thing I ended up picking up in December was Book Lovers by Emily Henry, because my library loan for the audio of this came in. And this was the last contemporary adult romance by Emily Henry that I hadn't yet read, so I was excited to finally get to it and check it out. And it's funny that I ended up reading her books in the order that I did, because the last one I read before this is my favorite, and this one ended up being my second favorite of her books that I've read. So this is a fun romance between a literary agent and a book editor, but there's a lot more to it than that. I will say almost like the romance in here felt more like it was a subplot than the actual plot. It felt more like a contemporary story with our main female character exploring her family relationships and how people kind of perceive her, and just a lot of like character growth for her specifically. My main complaint with this is just that I wish we got more in terms of the romance and the love interest. But I did really enjoy the character moments that we had with our main character, and I also really loved that this has the trope of like city girl in a small town. As a girl who's from a small town and who loves country life, seeing a character who's not used to that kind of experience some of the charm of that and comment on it was amusing for me. I think a lot of the time when you see that kind of trope, it can go very cheesy very quickly or very unrealistic. But I didn't have those complaints necessarily with this one, so I was happy about that. This was definitely a fun read, and if you're a romance reader who really enjoys digging into a character and their backstory, then I would definitely recommend this one, and I ended up giving it a 4-star rating. So those were all the books I read in the month of December. Let me know down below in the comments what your experience with any of these books are, also how you did in your December reading, if you managed to read a ton, or if you ended up kind of being slowed down by the holiday season. Do you have any books that you're carrying over into 2025 like me? Talk to me about all that good stuff down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out if you want to, and have a great day. Bye!